Contemporary Liberalism, the Great Society and After, Lecture 1. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about some selections from the Port Huron Statement, which was a political manifesto and statement of principles that the student group Students for a Democratic Society published in 1962, in the early years of the 60s and at the beginning of what came to be called the New Left, which was associated especially with both activism in favor of civil rights and also anti-war activism, and more broadly sort of calls for reform in various areas of human life throughout the 60s. And the Students for a Democratic Society were probably the most influential overall student group in the 60s, with, I think, the exception of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which was a civil rights organization, largely worked in the South to organize African Americans and sympathetic activists for civil rights. But the Students for a Democratic Society were very influential on campus. They became very influential in the anti-war movement. This comes before that. 1962 is before the wars really heated up. Kennedy is still president and all of that. Now, the Port Huron Statement, though, as you'll see in the subsequent lectures, hits on a lot of the notes that Lyndon Johnson will, when talking about his program, The Great Society, the various reforms that Lyndon Johnson during his presidency pushed for. And this was, basically 1964 through 1968 is mainly when Johnson was president. Now, but I want to put this in a little bit of connection with what you've read before. So when we read the New Deal, as I emphasized, when we read about the New Deal and we read the Franklin Roosevelt readings, I emphasized that in the New Deal, a lot of the emphasis, it's not exclusive. If you dig into the history, there's a lot there. But in terms of the big ticket items of the New Deal, it really is it's materialistic in the sense that the focus is really on making sure that people have material security. All of the big programs associated with the New Deal, either involving economic regulation or involving the provision of social services of various kinds, are all mostly aimed at providing material security. And remember, that's what Roosevelt even says in his State of the Union, that when he lists his second or economic Bill of Rights, he says all these things add up to security. Material security and opportunity. And that was really the goal. But if you think back to the earlier progressive movement, the progressives had a higher goal than just material necessity and insecurity. And that's what you really see in the Dewey reading, but you also see it in Woodrow Wilson and all that. Remember that, for progressives, really in the big picture is the idea that in order for individuals to have more freedom to develop their highest potential, the government must become actively involved in not only in regulating the economy, but in kind of monitoring and reforming other social institutions too. So, not just the distribution of wealth, but the workplace and how work is done. And you reform cities and you reform schools, and you might want to reform the family and other areas like that, that all major social institutions should be assessed, and if necessary, new conditions should be created in which people can flourish. And that's the general idea. So it's a much more expansive view of the role of government in society than the founders had. And for the founders, by and large, government was there to prevent harm. There's more to it than that, especially on the local level, but we just can't quite get into it. So the progressives had a higher view, and this really gets summarized in John Dewey's piece, The Future of Liberalism, which is what I talked about prior to this, because in The Future of Liberalism, you remember that Dewey ends by saying economic freedom or economic security is really just one part of a broader picture. And the real goal of a true liberalism, of a political philosophy whose goal is the enhancement of individuality and the enhancement of liberty, that the real goal of liberalism needs to be what he calls cultural freedom. The freedom of individuals to partake of all of the resources that society can make available for the cultivation of themselves as individuals, the cultivation of their mind, of their hearts, and of their lives. Right? And that's a very expansive view of, a role that government can play. in some ways, it goes back in some ways to aspects of kind of Aristotelianism and other approaches to politics that sees the political community as ultimately responsible for teaching the members of the community how to live good lives. Obviously, the Aristotelian vision of what a good life is going to vary quite a bit from John Dewey's, but you still have that kind of idea. Now, the New Deal, the actual New Deal documents that you read, and Franklin Roosevelt and his signature policies in the New Deal, didn't really aim at that really high stuff. That wasn't really there. Like I said, it was primarily aimed at economic security. And so what you find in the 60s, although stuff starts going in the 50s, what you find in the 60s, especially in the Great Society era, is when you begin to get more liberal policy, liberal politics, and liberal activism that pushes in that direction of what Dewey called cultural freedom, that starts pushing the federal government in various ways to expand beyond a concern with material abundance and security to a broader concern with making sure that Americans can live free and meaningful lives. And so you get this very kind of expansive vision, and we'll see that when we get to Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. But the way that I like to think about it is, to simplify a little bit, is you can say that, the New Deal basically had one big plank: material security. That was the big plank of its platform. When you get to the Great Society era, and really American liberalism or progressivism as it takes shape in the 60s, because I really don't think it's changed that much since the 60s. I mean, there might be different emphases and expansions and things like that, but really the liberalism that is formed in America by the late 60s is basically the liberalism or progressivism that we still have today in most ways. And so what 1960s liberalism does is, instead of one plank, it has three planks. So one, it continues the concern with material security. So, for example, despite all of the various accomplishments of the New Deal, there were other things that Franklin Roosevelt and other liberals had been pushing for that didn't get legislated. A big one was health care. You might remember in FDR's second Bill of Rights, he calls for, he says every American should have a right to health and to adequate medical care. But during the time of the New Deal, there was no legislation to that effect. So basically the provision of health services was in the hands of the market, private hands. So with the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson, that's when you get Medicaid, which provides health insurance to the poor, those who fall below the poverty line, and Medicare, which supplies health insurance to those who are of retirement age or collecting Social Security. So healthcare for the poor and for the old. And then over time, especially the Affordable Care Act during the Obama administration sought to extend that also to those who weren't necessarily poor and weren't necessarily old, but who couldn't afford insurance on the market. So and another big thing that happens in the Great Society is what was called the quote unquote the war on poverty. There was a ramping up of anti-poverty programs. So that plank of material security is still there and built upon, right? And that material security, you still see that today in the American left with progressivisms. So for example, with the popularity of Bernie Sanders and of the ideas of democratic socialism, the Occupy Wall Street movement of roughly 10 years ago, these were all, kind of sort of to a large extent focus on this concern with material security. But progressivism adds a couple more planks in the 1960s that are still with us. The second plank, so you have material security. The second one I refer to as anti-discrimination, that especially spurred on by the civil rights movement, which gets going in the 50s in the American South. The progressivism or liberalism in America, especially as housed in the Democratic Party, becomes actively concerned with using the federal government to root out racial discrimination and other forms of discrimination in American society. Prior to Brown v. Board of Education in the early 50s, for example, it was considered constitutionally allowed for states to have segregated schools and segregated public spaces. And that was affirmed by the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, which affirmed the notion of separate but equal. So you had this, in the wake of the Civil War and in the wake of Reconstruction, the racial discrimination is legislated again in the South, and you have the Jim Crow era when African Americans are denied basic civil rights and in many places basically live under a consistent fear of basically terrorism at the hands of white citizens, with lynchings and various forms of violence and intimidation. So you have Jim Crow in the South, and of course at the same time in the early 20th century during the Great Migrations, a number of African Americans had migrated from the South to the North to get industrial jobs in the cities, and this by the 1960s, 50s, and 60s it also turned into various urban problems of urban poverty, concentrated urban poverty, and what we now call the inner city, other concerns with racial discrimination. So especially led by the civil rights movement, progressives in the 1960s especially add to their agenda a concern with using the federal government to combat discrimination in American society. And these were areas that would have been considered before as kind of private spaces, more or less covered by freedom of assembly. So for example, who a business owner hires and why, what people a university admits to their university or not, would have been considered basically decisions that were in the hands of those who owned the establishment, and it wasn't really the business of government to monitor those things. That's why racial discrimination, also the exclusion of Jews from a number of universities, country clubs, things like that. You still had a lot of discrimination in society. And the federal government is enlisted to combat that. So you begin to get anti-discrimination legislation, regulating employment contracts. This is when you have the development of affirmative action programs, both with businesses, but also with universities and things like that. And the anti-discrimination agenda moves beyond just racial discrimination, because in the 1960s, obviously, this is also associated with the resurgent feminist movement. And then you also have the gay rights movement, which begins in the late 60s. And also in the late 60s or in the early 70s, you have the movement of Americans with disabilities. So you have this process whereby the kind of progressive political stance or the progressive policy stance is, since the role of the government is to monitor the functioning of social institutions to make sure that American citizens have the capacity to develop their full potential, one of the things that the federal government has to do is identify various marginal populations that are being discriminated against, and through regulation and other government programs, find ways to combat that discrimination and help them to become full members of society. And so you get a lot, this begins in a lot of ways with the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and expands from there. Another fruit of this is Title IX and the way that Title IX has affected things with gender equality. And obviously, the gay rights movement begins, which begins a push that, culminated not that long ago in the Supreme Court arguing that states cannot prohibit homosexual marriage. So there's this whole other part of liberalism that sometimes usually derisively described as identity politics. But, at its root is this notion that the government, as the representative of the public, should use its powers to make sure that people's life chances are not diminished because of discrimination against them that happens in the quote-unquote private sphere. So you've got a concern with material security, especially combating poverty, providing medical care. You have a concern with wiping out discrimination within society done through regulation and other kinds of affirmative action programs and things like that. And then there's a third plank, and I've never been able to figure out what to call the third plank. So I usually call it quality of life issues. And this, you might almost call this kind of cultural freedom issues. So this third plank has to do with just government policies that involve promoting things that the government or the population through the government just believes are good things that should be present in society, and that to some degree or other should be provided by government instead of by private associations or business or something like that. Now, a lot of things can be put under this quality of life mantle. In some ways, you could say that the environmental movement, which really begins in the 60s, could be put under here. This concern, not simply with combating pollution, but with the preservation of the natural environment, the preservation of ecosystems. So, not just the efficient harvesting of trees in national forests, but actually the preservation of wilderness areas so that you have areas that are as much as possible untouched by human beings, the preservation of natural beauty. So kind of like the preservation of nature, the preservation of endangered species for their own sake, not for economic reasons, not necessarily because of some benefit they directly provide to human beings, but just because there's this idea that a good society takes care of its natural environment and it is not unnecessarily rapacious or destructive in its relations with the natural world. So you could say under this quality of life plank, one of the things you have is environmentalism. But beyond that, you also have a number of other programs that are just concerned with promoting certain good things, as these programs conceived of them. So out of the Great Society, you have the creation, for example, of the National Endowment for the Arts, whereby the government provides grants to artists to help them make art. You have the National Endowment for the Humanities, where the government provides grants to scholars, to college professors and things like that to produce scholarship. You have the development of NPR and PBS, so non-commercial broadcast media. These are all areas where the thinking behind these programs was art and scholarship, and all sorts of public programming are very valuable things, but they're not necessarily profitable. And so if we simply rely on the market for these things, they're not going to be produced, and our society will be worse off. Our society will end up too materialistic, too much guided by the profit motive, and higher things will be neglected. This is also the era when you begin to have student loans available to people so that they can go to college, to give them access to more knowledge, right? And it was never simply about helping people to develop job skills. It was also about the mental and moral and emotional enrichment that can come with having higher education. So this third plank, so you have material security, you have anti-discrimination, and you have broad concerns with quality of life. And all of that kind of adds up in a sort of late 19th century way to our equivalent of what the progressives called the general welfare view, this idea that the government isn't simply there to prevent harm, to prevent and to provide remedies when people are harmed. There is that negative function, and that's important, but beyond that negative function, beyond the negative freedom of being free from harm, there's also a positive freedom, or a positive good to be after, that the government should be actively, positively promoting social institutions that help individuals to be both free and to cultivate their full potential. So that's really what you get. And like I said, most, most of what is associated with contemporary progressivism is still kind of variations on these themes. There hasn't been a fundamentally new plank added. There's still concern for the environment. It's intensified by the concern regarding climate change. You still have anti-discrimination, probably the thing that you hear about most nowadays, or the kind of social debates over transgender rights. So the transgender people, that's another group that has been identified as a marginal group that's being discriminated against. Immigrants sometimes get talked about that way. So you still have a concern with identifying and remedying discrimination within society in various forms. And you still have concern with material security, again, with the popularity of Bernie Sanders and democratic socialism is this idea that, much like Woodrow Wilson was saying 100 years ago, that America is a society that is marked by a great deal of material inequality, where a very small number of people have a large proportion of the wealth and therefore have a very large proportion of the influence over the direction of society, whereas lots and lots of other people live more economically precarious lives, where both in politics and in the economy, their material weakness means that they are disempowered and have very little influence, right? So these are all concerns that are with us still today. And so that's why I argue. And, I'm not a professional historian. I'm obviously simplifying things a lot, but that's why I see kind of the 1960s, the Great Society era, as the time when what we think of today in America as progressivism takes its recognizable form. So I had said I was going to talk about the Port Huron Statement, but this is already 20 minutes into the lecture. So in lecture 2, I will talk about the Port Huron Statement, which is a kind of statement by these young activists about their concerns about American society at the beginning of the 1960s and their call for greater freedom and greater democracy within that society. And then once we've done that, we will look at Lyndon Johnson and his Great Society programs.